When the topic of visa liberalization was discussed, the public already had the perception that the coveted visa stamp would no longer be a requirement. For example, Moldova, if I'm not mistaken, achieved visa liberalization in 4 years. For us, what timelines do you envision as most likely? I know this question has been asked many times, but it is likely what interests the general public the most.
Look, in reality, only 8 states have gone down this path, which means the comparable global experience we can be guided by when making predictions is very limited. However, it's a difficult comparison because the Republic of Armenia's starting point is not comparable to any of those 8 states. The Balkan states, for instance, typically already had a biometric system in place at the start of their visa liberalization negotiations, and if I'm not mistaken, Georgia did too. The content of the action plan is similar in many respects, but it also has very major differences for different states. In other words, there are roughly the same 4 areas that need to be brought into line with European Union standards to qualify for a visa-free regime. I want to emphasize that we have already started working on many points where our state was weak, or where infrastructure was completely lacking, not at the start of visa liberalization talks, but because we perceived it as a natural path for our sectoral development in many different areas. In the sector I'm responsible for, I must say that since 2022, we have been working very actively on the implementation of the biometric system, and that goal is now very close. If, for example, we had started this work only after receiving the action plan, it would have taken 3 years just to complete this phase alone. So I won't give a specific number of years, but I will make one important point. My subjective assessment is this. The action plan we will receive is, above all, a roadmap with clear, mandatory components for our state's most important sectors. This has significant added value, perhaps even more than the visa-free regime itself. Of course, the final and desired result is to have a visa-free regime, but we must recognize the other important values we are acquiring along this path. To describe it more figuratively, in many situations we note that our infrastructure is old, processes are inefficient, and management systems are flawed. Plans to reform an entire sector can sound very ambitious. Often they take the form of a legal act, but during processes like interagency review, they can be altered, lose their initial intent, or fail to achieve the desired result on the ground due to a lack of capacity, funding, or resources. But the action plan is a document that obliges our state to achieve a result that is acceptable to the European Union, and we should welcome this mandatory component. These are high international standards, and in fact, whether we want to or not, we will have to carry out a series of reforms that will ultimately only benefit our state.
Before moving on to the mandatory blocks, you mentioned there are 4 of them. A little while ago, Ms. Tavkian, you also talked about the Balkan countries. If we consider their example after becoming EU members and after visa liberalization, about 2 million people have emigrated from the 3 countries combined. I'd like to ask you directly about your preliminary scenarios or considerations regarding emigration. Do you have any specific numbers, or do you foresee any particular scenario? I understand we're talking about being in Schengen zone for 90 days and every 180-day period, but have you calculated these risks?
This is one of our biggest challenges. You are right to say that the situation could change dramatically given our state's already unfavorable migration picture. It is no secret that for decades since independence, we have been considered a country of emigration, and the term is very relevant in our media and daily lives. Although the meaning of the word has shifted, nowadays leaving one's country of permanent residence for another, even for permanent residents, does not necessarily have a component of forced migration. In other words, it is not a forced movement. It is a choice, very often based on the desire for a more prosperous life. This is a choice made in the exercise of a right, and the individual bears the consequences. However, we were also witnessing another situation where the liberalized visa regime is now at threat in our neighboring country. In this respect, the experience of Georgia is very instructive, where the number of asylum seekers more than doubled in the year following visa liberalization. We face this risk as well, and perhaps the risk is even higher in our state. While our number of asylum seekers in all EU member states typically reaches 4,000 to 5,000 a year, only 2020 was an exception due to pandemic restrictions, when the number did not exceed 2,000. The preliminary estimate for the last year, 2024, is close to 6,000. Therefore, we must be in a position to contain this indicator under a liberalized visa regime. Obviously, migration is a multidisciplinary field. It is not possible for our department, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, to adopt legal acts that would prevent migration. That is not how it works. In other words, it is not possible to simply close the borders or to prohibit certain groups from leaving the country. The right to free movement is a fundamental right.
During one of his recent press conferences, Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan clearly stated that yes, we want to become a member of the EU. According to his vision, in about 20 years, we will be a member of the European Union. Ms. Davtyan, in your opinion, what political process does visa liberalization imply in this context, or does it have a political subtext for Armenia?
This is a common question for all states going through the path of visa liberalization. Is this more of a political or a technical issue? You see, the action plan will essentially be a series of technical measures. The task is very simple: carry out the specified actions to get a visa-free regime. Where is the political component? If the plan requires us to have biometric passports, we announce a tender and introduce them. Or take integrated border management, another major area that will be a key component of the action plan. Is it bad that we will have integrated border management? As I've said in my speeches, states invest heavily in border management because of its importance. Currently, our state does not have this infrastructure. Is there a political component here? On the contrary, it seems our European partners are showing us how to build modern infrastructure. However, the process of reaching this point, the start of the visa liberalization dialogue, was indeed political. We can make a conditional distinction here. The negotiations up to this point have been political. In other words, the European Union has made the commitment that it is ready to have a visa-free regime with our state. This, of course, can be interpreted as a political process, as it is about bilateral commitments. Within my competence, that is all I can say.